did you say?
I said no. I will not end my engagement.
You will do as I say.
No, Mother.
You're the older one. You sacrifice.
Not this time.
As if that settled everything, Cassidy didn't gasp. She didn't look away. She just glanced at the ring on my finger, like she was already measuring it for her own hand. What neither of them knew was that I had been carrying a locked wooden box in my bag since the moment I walked through that front door, and inside it was everything my grandmother had left behind to make sure this family could never take anything from me again. So, who exactly had walked into a trap that night? If stories like this one speak to something you've felt before, consider subscribing. New stories go up every week, and I'd love for you to be here for them. I grew up in a house that taught me one thing above all else. Being born first was not a privilege. It was a debt I would spend the rest of my life repaying. The house itself was beautiful, a century-old colonial on the western shore of Lake Mendota, just outside Madison. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch that caught the late afternoon light in a way that made everything look softer than it actually was. My grandmother Harriet had lived there most of her adult life, and when we came to visit as children, the place felt enormous and safe and full of her. She kept a jar of lemon candies on the kitchen counter and classical music playing low from a radio she never replaced. I loved that house. What happened inside our own home, 40 minutes away, was a different story entirely. My mother, Lorraine, had a system, though she never called it that. She would have called it motherhood or common sense, or simply the way things worked in a family. The system was this: Cassidy was younger, more sensitive, and therefore more fragile. I was older, more capable, and therefore more responsible. Every conflict between us got filtered through that logic. Every time Cassidy cried, the solution was Elena. Every time Cassidy wanted something I already had, the solution was still Elena. My mother never framed it as taking. She framed it as sharing, or being the bigger person, or understanding that Cassidy just needed a little more. Cassidy, to be fair, was not a cruel child. I want to be honest about that, because it matters later. When we were small, she genuinely was sensitive, the kind of kid who cried at sad commercials and got attached to stray animals and fell apart when things didn't go the way she expected. There was something real in that, but my mother never taught her to manage it. Instead, Lorraine taught her something far more dangerous: that when you feel bad, Elena will fix it. That if you cry long enough and look wounded enough, your older sister will fold. And Cassidy learned that lesson the way children learn everything completely, and without realizing she was learning it at all. My father, Gordon, saw what was happening. I know that now, and I suspected it even as a kid. He had this way of going very quiet during certain moments, not the comfortable quiet of a man at peace, but the tight, deliberate quiet of a man who had made a private calculation and decided that silence was the safest result. He loved me, I believe that, but he loved the absence of conflict more, and in our house, those two things were almost never available at the same time. The only person who never made me choose was my grandmother. Harriet Kessler had raised one son and watched him marry a woman she understood far better than he did. She never said a cruel word about Lorraine, not directly, but when I was with her, she had a way of saying true things so plainly that they landed like a hand on your shoulder. "You were born first," she told me once, when I was about 12 and had just handed Cassidy my birthday gift because Cassidy had cried about not getting the same one. "That means you came sooner. It doesn't mean you owe her your whole life." I didn't fully understand it then, but I remembered it. In the last years of her life, Harriet's health declined steadily, and the people who showed up were exactly the people you would have predicted. Lorraine was always too busy. Cassidy had work or plans, or some reason that shifted week to week, but always added up to the same thing: absence. I drove from Milwaukee to Madison every single weekend. I scheduled Harriet's appointments, filled her prescriptions, and used my own money to repair the porch railing that had been rotting for 2 years. I did it because I loved her. I also did it because being in that house felt like the only place where my presence was not conditional on what I was willing to give up. About 8 months before she died, Harriet called me into the sitting room after dinner and handed me a small wooden box with a brass lock. The key was on a thin chain that she pressed into my palm and closed my fingers around. She told me the box held legal documents and that I should not open it until someone in the family tried to take something I could not afford to lose. "You'll know when," she said. She was not being dramatic. She was being precise. What I learned much later was that Harriet had also made a phone call. Her attorney, a woman named Rebecca Stroud, received specific instructions. If she did not hear from me directly before Thanksgiving of the year I became engaged, she was to come to the Lake Mendota house that evening. Harriet had given Rebecca the address and the standing instruction years in advance, knowing that the people most likely to prevent me from opening that box would be the same people in the room when I needed to open it. She had removed the possibility that I could be talked out of it before I arrived. I met Wesley Vaughn 2.5 years ago on a historic preservation project in Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. He was the structural engineer. I was handling the interior rehabilitation. We disagreed about a load-bearing wall on the 2nd floor for the better part of 3 weeks before we figured out we were actually arguing about the same thing from opposite ends. After that, the disagreements became conversations, and the conversations became dinners. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I realized I had stopped keeping a careful accounting of what I was giving versus what I was getting. That was new for me, and it felt like something worth protecting. He proposed on the shore of Lake Michigan on a Tuesday evening in March, with no audience and no production. Just the two of us and the wind off the water and a ring he had picked out alone because he said he already knew. I said yes before he finished the question. When I told Lorraine the following Sunday, she congratulated me briefly and pivoted almost immediately to how Cassidy might feel about the timing. I let the conversation end the way those conversations always ended. I should have read it as a warning. We arrived at the Lake Mendota house on Thanksgiving afternoon, and I watched Wesley handle the extended family the way he handled everything with steady, grounded warmth that had nothing to perform. I felt, for a moment, genuinely lucky. That feeling lasted until Cassidy found him within the first 10 minutes. She navigated toward him the way water finds the lowest point in a room. She touched his arm when she laughed, brought up the conference at Monona Terrace where they had exchanged maybe 10 minutes of small talk 2 years ago, and described it to the cousins standing nearby as though it had been a significant moment in both their lives. Wesley was polite and gave nothing back, but Cassidy didn't seem to need anything back. She wasn't talking to him. She was performing for the room. When we sat down for dinner, my mother stood up. Lorraine did not raise her voice. She announced, in the tone she used when confirming a reservation, that there was a family matter that needed to be addressed before the meal. She said Cassidy had carried feelings for Wesley for 2 years. She said, I had known this and pursued him anyway. She said Cassidy's store was failing, that Cassidy was struggling, and that a man like Wesley was exactly what her younger daughter needed to stabilize her life. She had brought a folder containing venue brochures, dress samples, and a handwritten guest list. She set it on the table like evidence. Wesley told her clearly that he had never been in a relationship with Cassidy, had never wanted one, and was not going to change that. My mother acknowledged his statement the way you acknowledge a child who has said something sweet but incorrect with a patient, dismissive nod, and then continued talking to me as though he had not spoken. She told me I was older, more established, capable of starting over. She told me Cassidy could not afford another loss. Then she gave me the choice, the engagement or the family. I looked at Cassidy. She was watching me the way she had watched me my entire childhood, with that expression that lived somewhere between genuine hurt and patient certainty. When we were small, I used to believe the hurt was real and the certainty was just stubbornness. Sitting there, I finally understood I had it backward. The certainty had always been the foundation. The hurt was just the surface she pressed when the foundation alone wasn't getting results. I took the ring off my finger and set it on the table in front of me. Cassidy's expression shifted immediately, a small, involuntary loosening around the mouth, the beginning of relief. She thought I was about to do what I had always done. I am Cassidy's sister, I said. I am not her caretaker, her substitute, or her sacrifice. I am not giving up Wesley. Lorraine walked around the table and slapped me across the face. The room contracted sound, breath, movement until all that was left was the sting along my jaw and her voice saying, quietly and without emotion, that I was the older one, and the older one sacrifices. No one stood up. Gordon sat with his hands flat on the tablecloth. The relatives looked at each other or at the wall. Cassidy looked at the ring. In that silence, I understood something with a clarity I had never managed before. If I walked out of that house crying, Lorraine would spend the next decade telling the story as proof that I was selfish and cold and had ruined Thanksgiving for everyone. The only version of this night she could not control was the one where I did not leave. I reached into my bag and took out the wooden box. I set it in the center of the table between the gravy boat and the candlesticks, used the brass key to open the lid, and looked at my mother across the table. For the first time in 33 years, I did not look away first. The first document I pulled from the box was a will, not the one Lorraine had described after Harriet died, the one she had summarized in vague, dismissive terms as already handled. This was dated 14 months before my grandmother passed, notarized at Rebecca Stroud's office in downtown Madison, and witnessed by two people I had never met. I set it flat on the table and read the relevant section aloud. Harriet had not left the Lake Mendota house to my father. She had transferred it into a trust and named me as the sole beneficiary. The house we were sitting in, the table, the chandelier above us, the wraparound porch where my mother had hung her own wind chimes 2 summers ago, none of it had ever legally belonged to Lorraine. My mother's response was immediate. She said Harriet had been elderly, that the document was the product of a mind no longer reliable, that I had spent those final years isolating my grandmother and steering her toward decisions she would never have made on her own. She delivered all of this in the same measured tone she used for everything, the tone designed to make the other person feel like they were the one being unreasonable. What she did not do was look surprised. I watched Cassidy during this, and that was when I saw it, the thing that shifted something permanently in my chest. My sister was not confused. She was not asking questions or looking between me and my mother, trying to piece the story together. She was staring at the tablecloth, jaw set, waiting. She already knew there was another will. She had known through 2 years of Sunday phone calls and birthday texts and dinners, where I had talked about Harriet like we were two people grieving the same loss the same way. She had known the whole time and said nothing. When Cassidy finally looked up and found me watching her, she said that I had always been Harriet's favorite and that it wasn't fair to punish the rest of the family for a preference Harriet had never bothered to hide. She said the house should stay with our parents because they were the ones who actually needed it, and that I had a career, a fiancé, a life in Milwaukee, and didn't need one more thing the rest of them couldn't have. There it was, the reframe. My legal inheritance converted, in 30 seconds, into one more thing I was being selfish about. Before I could respond, Lorraine pivoted. She said the house was beside the point. The real issue was Wesley, and my pattern of taking opportunities before Cassidy had a chance to reach them. She was pulling the room's attention off the documents and back toward the story she had been constructing all evening. It almost worked. Wesley stood up. He pulled out his phone, opened his messages, and began to read. He described the conference at Monona Terrace 2 years ago, the actual version. They had spoken for less than 10 minutes. Cassidy had asked for his number. He had declined, and they had not spoken again until he started dating me, at which point the messages began arriving. He read several aloud. Early ones questioning whether I was right for him, later ones proposing they meet privately, and eventually ones offering my mother's professional connections as an incentive if he ended the engagement. He said he had saved everything because the messages had become threatening enough that he wanted a record. Then he looked at Cassidy directly and said what needed to be said, that he was not a prize to be reassigned, that there had never been a relationship between them, and that the story she had been telling was not real and had never been real. Cassidy did not cry this time. She stood up and something in her face rearranged into something rawer than I had ever seen, not the practiced wound she deployed in front of our mother, but something that had been sitting underneath it for a long time. She said I had everything. She listed it: the grades, the career, the apartment, the man, the grandmother who called every Sunday. She said she had spent her entire life measuring herself against a version of me she could never reach. And then, in the middle of it, she said something she clearly had not planned to say. She said Harriet had never once called to check on her. Only me. The table went still in a different way, not the contracted silence of the slap, but something more complicated, with more air in it. I looked at my sister and I saw, for just a moment, the actual shape of what had happened to her. Not the manipulation, not the entitlement, but the child underneath all of it, the one who had grown up in the same house I had and drawn entirely different conclusions about her own worth. Lorraine had broken both of us. She had taken from me directly and given to Cassidy, and what she had given Cassidy was not love. It was a substitute for love, a constant rerouting of other people's things that had taught my sister she could not generate anything valuable on her own. That understanding did not change what I had to do, but it changed something in the way I turned back to the documents. The second folder contained bank records, and I took a moment before opening it, not from hesitation, but because I already understood that whatever was inside would be the thing that made tonight impossible to walk back from for anyone at this table. Harriet had established a trust fund alongside the property transfer, a separate account to cover taxes, maintenance, and repairs on the house for 10 years, with the remainder earmarked for me to start a community-focused architecture studio. I had never known the fund existed. According to the statements in front of me, there was a reason for that. Most of the money was gone. $183,000 had moved out of the trust over 18 months, withdrawn using an old power of attorney document that should have been superseded by the will. The money went into accounts connected to Cassidy's boutique rent, credit card balances, purchasing trips to New York, a rebranding campaign that had not saved the store. When the boutique kept losing money, more withdrawals followed to cover the evidence of the earlier ones. I set the bank records on the table without comment and looked at my father. Gordon had not moved in several minutes. He was staring at his hands, both of them flat on the tablecloth. He did not look at the statements. He did not need to. He already knew what they said, and the fact that he already knew was written all over him in a way that no one in that room could miss. Then came a knock at the front door. Wesley answered it. Rebecca Stroud was composed, carrying a leather document case that she set on the side table near the entry. She confirmed what the documents showed. The will was valid. It superseded all prior paperwork, and I was the legal owner of the property we were currently occupying. She also confirmed that the power of attorney Lorraine had used to access the trust fund had been formally revoked 11 months before Harriet died, making every withdrawal that followed legally unauthorized. Lorraine told her she was mistaken. Rebecca opened her document case and said nothing further. My mother changed tactics. She said that a daughter who would bring lawyers to a family dinner was not someone Harriet would have wanted her to be. She said I had everything, more than enough, and that choosing to destroy my family over property and money was proof of exactly the kind of person I had always been underneath the composed exterior I showed the world. I asked her one question, whether she had ever, in my entire life, thought of me as her daughter or only as the resource she kept on hand to absorb whatever Cassidy couldn't handle. She didn't answer. She said, "You can start over. Your sister cannot." And then Gordon stood up. He told the table that he had known about the will before Harriet died. He had known about the trust fund. He had known that Cassidy's boutique was being kept alive with money that belonged to me. He had signed a document after Harriet's death, confirming there were no significant assets remaining in the estate, which was not true, and he had signed it because Lorraine told him that if he didn't, she would leave. He had told himself I was strong enough to absorb the loss without knowing about it. He had told himself I would be fine. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. My mother's slap had shocked the room. The documents had stunned it. Gordon's confession emptied it of pretense, of the comfortable shared fiction that everyone at that table had been willing to maintain until that evening. I had spent years telling myself my father simply didn't know. That if he had known, things would have been different. What I understood now, sitting in the house that had always belonged to me, was that he had known everything, done nothing, and dressed his silence up as a compliment to my strength. I had the house. I had the documents. I had Rebecca Stroud seated calmly with a full legal record of everything that had been taken. And I had never felt less like celebrating anything in my life. Rebecca spoke first after Gordon sat back down. She told me I had 3 options available immediately. I could require Lorraine and Cassidy to vacate the premises. I could freeze the remaining trust accounts pending a full audit. And I could initiate civil proceedings to recover the $183,000 that had been withdrawn without authorization. None of these required anyone's cooperation or agreement. They were simply what the law allowed, and they were all mine to exercise or decline. Lorraine heard this and did what she always did when the leverage shifted. She changed the story. She was no longer the woman who had struck her daughter across the face an hour earlier. She was a mother in pain, watching her family collapse over paperwork and grudges. She said, taking her own mother and sister to court would follow me for the rest of my life. She said the people in this town knew our family, and that a woman who sued her grieving parents over an inheritance would not be viewed kindly regardless of what any document said. She said Harriet would not have wanted this. And then she said it again, softer, as though softness would accomplish what volume had not. She did not say she was sorry, not for the slap, not for the will, not for the $183,000, not once. Cassidy spoke next. She said that if I genuinely loved her, if anything I had ever said about being her sister meant anything at all, I would split the property, drop the legal questions about the trust, and classed her, and step back so she could approach Wesley on her own terms. She said people changed when circumstances changed, and she deserved the opportunity to find out. Earlier in the evening, I had seen something in Cassidy that I recognized as real, the loneliness underneath the performance, the child who had been handed other people's things instead of being taught to build her own. I had let myself feel something close to grief for that version of her. But what she was asking right now, after everything already said and proven in front of 14 witnesses, was not coming from that wounded place. It was coming from the place that had always believed wanting something loudly and persistently was a form of earning it. The two things could both be true at once. She had a real wound, and she had chosen, repeatedly, to use it as a weapon. The wound was not her fault. The choice was. That did not make me angry. It made me clear. I picked up the ring from where I had set it at the beginning of the evening and put it back on my finger. I did it slowly, without looking away from my mother. Then I said what I had needed to say for 33 years, and I said it without raising my voice, because I had learned from watching Lorraine that the sentences which do the most damage are the ones delivered in a register that never lets the other person claim they were provoked. I told her I was Cassidy's sister, and that I had been glad to be, for most of my life. But I was not her understudy, her backup, or her safety net. I was not the person appointed to absorb her disappointments, so she never had to develop the tolerance for them herself. Wesley was not available for redistribution. The house was not a shared resource to be divided according to who currently needed it more. And my life, the one I had built, the choices I had made, the man I had chosen was not a communal asset that this family had any remaining claim on. A family that only functions when one member is willing to lose is not a family. It is an arrangement. And I was done with the arrangement. Lorraine told me I would regret this when I had no one left. I told her I had been alone inside this family for most of my life, and that the geography was about to match the reality. She took Cassidy by the arm, pushed back from the table, and before she left the room, she said one final thing that I had always been selfish, that she had simply been too patient to say it, and that she hoped whatever I was protecting was worth what I was burning down to keep it. Then she walked out, and the sound of the front door closing behind them was the quietest thing I had heard all night. The room stayed still for a moment. Then, one by one, people began to move, reaching for glasses, exhaling in the way people do when a pressure system finally breaks. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in several years caught my eye from across the table and gave me a small nod that meant, I saw what happened, and I am not going to pretend I didn't. Two of my aunts came to me separately over the next 20 minutes, and said versions of the same thing, that they had watched what Lorraine did to me my entire childhood, and told themselves it wasn't their place, that Elena was strong, that Elena could handle it. One of them cried. I accepted the apology without making it easier than it was. I told her that the next time she watched something like that happen to someone, I hoped she would remember how this felt and act sooner. Rebecca secured the documents, gave me her direct number, and said the accounts would need to be flagged before the end of the business week to prevent further withdrawals. I told her to proceed. Gordon had not left the table. He sat in the same chair, in the same posture, and waited. He was not waiting to be forgiven. I think he understood that forgiveness was not something I had available to give him that night, and possibly not for a long time after. He was waiting because he had spent decades leaving rooms at the wrong moment, and he had made a private decision, somewhere between his confession and the end of that dinner, that he would not do it again. I sat down across from him. He told me he was sorry. I told him I believed he meant it, and that meaning it was not the same as it being enough. He said he knew. I told him the thing I had lost that evening, the thing that hurt more than the slap, more than the will, and more than $183,000 was the version of him I had been protecting in my own mind for 30 years. The one who didn't know. The one who would have acted differently if he had. I had needed that version of him to be real, because the alternative meant I had been alone in that house in a way that was not accidental. It was not accidental. He had looked at what was happening to me and made a calculation, and the calculation had always come out the same way. He did not argue with any of that. He said it was true, and that he had known it was true while it was happening. He asked if there was something practical, he could do something immediate and concrete that would let him begin to demonstrate rather than simply declare. I told him he could make sure Lorraine and Cassidy were out of the house within 30 days. He said he would handle it personally, and that he would not be returning with them. Wesley did not try to summarize the evening or put a frame around it. He sat with me in the kitchen after everyone else had gone and made coffee, and did not say that everything was going to be fine. He knew me well enough to understand I didn't need that. What I needed was to sit in that kitchen, in that house, and let the fact of it settle the fact that this was mine, that Harriet had made sure of it, that the woman who had spent decades arranging my life around Cassidy's comfort had just walked out of a house that had never belonged to her. 6 months later, Wesley and I were married at the Olbrich Botanical Gardens on a Saturday morning in late May when the air still had the cool edge of spring in it. We kept the guest list to 30 people, friends, a few colleagues, the cousin who had nodded, one of the aunts who had apologized, and spent the intervening months proving she meant it. Lorraine and Cassidy were not invited, because neither of them had acknowledged responsibility for anything, and I had decided that my threshold for presence at my own wedding was exactly that low and no lower. Gordon was invited as a guest. He sat in the third row and did not cry until the vows. I walked to Wesley alone. I had thought about this in advance and decided it was the right choice, not as a statement, but because the tradition of being given away had never made sense to me, and after that Thanksgiving, it made even less. I was not a thing to be transferred from one set of hands to another. The walk down the aisle was mine. The following November, I hosted Thanksgiving at the Lake Mendota house for the first time. I replaced the old rectangular table with a round one because a round table has no head, and everyone sat level and reached the same dishes. Harriet's wooden box sat on the shelf near the window that looks out over the water, unlocked, with nothing left inside that needed protecting. Gordon arrived with a pie he had made from scratch, badly, in a way that suggested he had never baked anything before in his life and was not willing to let that stop him. He asked if he could help clear the table. I said yes. He spent the rest of the evening doing small, quiet, useful things without calling attention to any of them. That was not forgiveness. Forgiveness moves on its own schedule. And I had learned by then not to rush things that need to move slowly, but it was a beginning. A different kind of accounting, one where the entries could still change. When dinner was over and the last guest had gone, I stood at the window and looked out at the lake. The water was dark and very still. Harriet had looked at this same view for most of her life, and she had understood something I was only now catching up to, that the people who love you correctly do not ask you to get smaller to make room for someone else. They make room. They build the table larger. They hand you the key and trust you to know when to use it. She had given me that key years before I needed it. I had finally used it, and the house was still standing. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because some version of it felt familiar. A lot of us grew up being told that being older, or stronger, or more capable meant we were supposed to want less, that our needs were somehow more negotiable than everyone else's. But love was never meant to work like that. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to keep the things that belong to you. You are allowed to stop being the person who absorbs every loss, so that someone else never has to feel one. If you want more stories like this one, stories about people who